Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on all the places, Twitter, Instagram, and now TikTok at Hawk Blogger. We are like 50 followers away on TikTok from hitting the 1,000 mark, which is great in just a couple of weeks, which really appreciate all the support there. And that will be fun. We are kind of in this odd place of the NFL season where the Seahawks season's over, but it's not over. So we do have a game coming up on Sunday. I have spent zero time on a tail of the tape. We're not going to do a first look this week. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to dive into details about a game that honestly does not have any effect on the outcome of this season. And also that we don't really even know who's going to play. The Rams are going to play their backups and, whatever. I will say people that are like, I'm not even going to watch this game. That will never be me. I hope I'm going to watch this game, and I hope the Seahawks win this game, and I hope that they play well, and I hope they look good doing it, and I hope they have fun, and I hope they end the season on a good note. So I certainly will be watching this game, and we'll have fun talking about it. And who knows, maybe we'll do a watch party or something if folks want to do that. But we'll try to find some way to make sure the community stays connected as we go through this, and then we transition into really the off season. We've kind of started that a little bit, but we're still in it. So one of the things that we are going to spend some time on in this episode, probably the bulk of what we'll spend the time on in this episode, is that Pro Bowl selections came out for the 2024 season. And we will talk about who made the Pro Bowl. We will talk about some of the alternates and some of the implications for all of this. So that'll be fun. Always, a controversial day in the NFL calendar. And so we'll get into some of that. Before I do that, a couple just news and notes. The folks that are wondering, like, where's Real Hawk Talk this week? It wasn't on last night. Well, we gave folks the night off last night. We are going to do it tonight. So Dana O'Gorman and Nathan Ernst are due on. So 6 o'clock tonight, we are expected to do Real Hawk Talk. So it is a double pod Thursday instead of a double pod Wednesday. And appreciate everybody, being patient as we find the times that work for us. And as the off season comes in, Real Hawk Talk kind of has its own schedule, and I will continue to do this daily. This is episode 284 straight days. We will keep plowing through each and every day with new, fresh Seahawks content. I will say it's a little daunting to think about the fact that Real Jeff Simmons will be potentially not as available as he has been this year, knowing that he's expecting his first kid, and I know what that can do to a household and to your time. So we'll see. I kind of count on Jeff to do all these draft obsessed shows with me. We'll see what he's able to do once that happens. All right, so let's get to it. The Seahawks, are a team that honestly does not register for most people this year. Did not have, I don't think, a lot of performances that really stood out for the national press to pick up. The team itself, when it was on national TV, pretty much was a nothing burger and looked bad in most of those cases. Those are the situations where generally Pro Bowl consideration, which is a third fan voting, a third player voting, and a third coaches, they don't generally result in a lot of Pro Bowlers. And the fact of the matter is, it didn't for the Seahawks. The Seahawks land exactly one player on the initial Pro Bowl roster, and that player is Devon Witherspoon. And I think it's kind of interesting that Devon Witherspoon is the lone representative, because of all the players that you'd think for the Seahawks that would get strong consideration, a lot of times it's the statistics that get you in the Pro Bowl, or at least get recognition. And Devon Witherspoon, we talked about it all year. The coach has been asked about it all year. He's this really good player, but he doesn't really get the stats this year that would allow you to potentially really recognize him for how good of a player he is. And that turned out to not be the case here because players, coaches recognize who Devon Witherspoon is, how good he is, and he makes the Pro Bowl. I think that's pretty significant. And you might ask, like, how significant is it? Well, Devon Witherspoon becomes just the first. He's the first player to for the Seahawks to make the Pro Bowl in both his first and his second season in the NFL since one Russell Wilson in 2012 and 2013. There's only been 4 other Seahawks in Seahawks franchise history besides Devon Witherspoon to make the Pro Bowl in each of his first 2 seasons in the NFL. The other 3 outside of Russell Wilson, Lofa Tatupu in 2005 and 2006, Rufus Porter in 1988 and 1989. Now, that should be noted, Rufus Porter was making it as a special teams player in that situation. It's possible in 1989 he made it as a pass rusher, but Rufus Porter was initially a special teams standout. And then Fred Young, Fred with 2 Ds, in 1984 and 1985. So let's just give you a little bit of awareness of how rare it's been for the Seahawks to get a player to make the Pro Bowl in both their first and second seasons. Let's go ahead and while we're at it, let's look at where the Seahawks as far as rookies are to make the Pro Bowl. There's a few of them. But before we dive too deep into that, I think it's great that Devon Witherspoon made it. I'm really happy about that, and I think it's very deserving. And the fact of the matter is, the Seahawks, there's some players, we're going to talk about it, that there's a real case that they should have been on here. But Pro Bowl is more influenced by team outcome and how they perform in big moments on the national stage than other recognition awards. And I don't think it's crazy that the Seahawks got one Pro Bowler this year. I don't think that's crazy. We'll talk about some of the players. They did get alternates. So let's talk about who the alternates are for the Seahawks. So the Seahawks, I believe, if my math is right, had 4 or 5. I think they had 5 alternates selected to the Pro Bowl. And those alternates are Michael Dixon, Julian Love, Boye Mafe, interesting one there, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and Leonard Williams. And now I think the headline for most Seahawks fans that have most Seahawks fans up in arms is Leonard Williams. And the first thing you're going to say is, how in the world can Leonard Williams not make the Pro Bowl? And I think Leonard Williams, I did a show where I said I think he should be getting Defensive Player of the Year votes. And I wouldn't be surprised if he gets a sack or 2 on Sunday and ends up with double-digit sacks, the only interior lineman that will do that. The interior lineman that made it ahead of him in the NFC, Jalen Carter and Dexter Lawrence are the starters, and then Vita Vea is the backup. And let's take a look at how those specific players performed. But I will just tell you, when I saw that initially, I was like, I get it. Those are very talented players who have had, I think, they playing for teams that have had, other than Dexter Lawrence, playing for teams that have had bigger years in bigger markets in bigger moments. Tampa Bay is probably going to be a playoff team. Vita Vea is a key reason why. Vita Vea is one of the most dominant interior linemen in the entire NFL. So I think that one's a little bit in question. He had 6 sacks this year relative to, Leonard Williams, who has 9 so far. And when you look at, I think he had 10 tackles for loss, but let me take a look for sure. Tackles for loss, NFL. Now, tackles for loss, I will say, is counted differently on different sites. So I'm going to look at a few different places. Vita Vea, he's pretty far down this list on, yeah. He had 9 tackles for loss, according to this site, where Leonard Williams had 15. I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that Leonard Williams should have made it over Vita Vea. I think that's the one that really, I agree, doesn't make as much sense. Now, Dexter Lawrence, for what it's worth, was going to be Defensive Player of the Year most likely before he got hurt. He's hurt. He's not going to play. So Leonard Williams will be on the Pro Bowl roster. I'm almost certain of it. But he did make the initial Pro Bowl roster, and that has some significance. So, usually contractually that has some significance. I'll talk about some of the contractual implications that kicked in automatically with this, but generally it's making the first team, like making the initial Pro Bowl roster, not making it as an alternate, is usually how that goes. But, I don't know that Leonard Williams just got the recognition based on how the Seahawks played and where the Seahawks play that Leonard Williams deserves. So I will join the chorus of saying Leonard Williams absolutely should have been a Pro Bowler. I think you could make the case he should have been a Pro Bowl starter. If we look at Jalen Carter, let's look at Jalen Carter's numbers. He had 12 tackles for loss. He has 4.5 sacks. I think you start getting into pressure numbers. And if we go by position and we look at interior defensive linemen and we look just at pressures, Jalen Carter had 53 pressures on the year. That is one more than Leonard Williams. I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that Leonard Williams should have been a starter over Jalen Carter. Now, Jalen Carter plays for the Philadelphia Eagles in a primary media market and for a team that, was pressing for the number 1 seed in the NFC and is definitely in the playoffs. I'm not surprised by it. I don't think it's the right call, but I'm not surprised by it. So I think of the guys that made it ahead of Leonard Williams, I'm not sure there's a really strong case that any of them should have made it over him. I think the fact that Dexter Lawrence did, I can kind of make sense of, since, like I said, I think he was Defensive Player of the Year quality before. And so it'll resolve itself to some degree because Leonard Williams will make it when Dexter Lawrence, I think, gets pulled off. I've not looked at every alternate, so maybe there's some other alternate that will get ahead of him, but I think he will. And we'll see what happens. Jalen Carter and or Vita Vea may not be available to play because of the playoffs, and that would affect also additional guys getting in. So I think that's the biggest one that people are going to be up in arms about. As far as the other, alternates, I think Julian Love goes from making the Pro Bowl last year as an initial safety on the roster, which was a surprise for a lot of folks, including Julian Love, to being an alternate. And this year, the safeties are Xavier McKinney, who I think leads the NFL in interceptions, Budda Baker, and Brian Branch. I'm not going to argue with any of those. I understand that there's some folks that might, but I think that that's a very solid set of safeties to make the list. I don't think any of those are clearly ones that Julian Love should knock off, knock off the list. The next guy that I think people will probably be talking about is Jackson Smith-Njigba, who had a great year. He's on pace to potentially break Tyler Lockett's club record for receptions in a season. Granted, it'll be in one extra game in a 17-game season versus 16, but still, Really, really good year. And if we look at who made the Pro Bowl as receivers in the NFC, it's Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Terry McLaurin, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So let's take a look at those guys. Let's take a look at those guys and see what the case could be made for who should have made it. And so let's look at receiving, and Amon-Ra St. Brown is second in the NFL in receptions, 109 receptions for almost 1,200 yards and 12 touchdowns. Sorry, like, excuse me, guys. I'm still getting over this this sickness. Apologies. Comes on and I don't see it. JSN doesn't get in over Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think there's no question. And I'm going to cough again. Let me mute. Sorry about that. The other guys that made it, CeeDee Lamb, 101 receptions, 1,200 yards, 6 touchdowns. You know, you could say, I mean, those numbers are all better than JSN's, other than the touchdowns, which is essentially the same. Man, I'm going through it here. All right. CeeDee Lamb, we talked about, so relatively the same. Justin Jefferson, is anyone going to argue that? 100 receptions, almost 1,500 yards, 10 touchdowns. I'm certainly not going to make that case. You can if you want, but I'm not going to. And then Terry McLaurin. And Terry McLaurin is the one that there's a little bit of question here. So Terry McLaurin has 74 receptions for 1,034 yards, but he does have 12 touchdowns. That's double the amount of touchdowns that JSN has. JSN has a lot more receptions and he has more yards. I think you could make the case for it. But again, the Commanders are going to the playoffs. They're having a better year in a better market, or at least a bigger market with, more marquee moments against other primetime teams like the Eagles, like the Sunday Night Football game against the Falcons. So I personally think JSN is better, has had a better season than Terry McLaurin, but I understand why he's not in it. I think if I am honestly saying a guy that should potentially be in it over Terry McLaurin and over JSN is Malik Neighbors. I mean, Malik Neighbors has 104 catches, 1,140 yards, and 6 touchdowns. And he's doing it with maybe the worst quarterback situation you can imagine, with a bad offensive line as a rookie. And he missed a couple of games. I think Malik Neighbors has a stronger case than JSN. That's my opinion. Outside of that, I think the right guys have made it. So yeah, it would have been nice for JSN to make it as a initial roster player. But the fact that he made it as an alternate, I think is reasonable. I'm not going to bang the table and say that he absolutely should have made it. It does have some effect on some rookie salary stuff, which we'll talk about in a second. But that one for me makes sense. Someone asking if I've got COVID. No, I do not have COVID. Just getting over some sort of cold. Let's see. So outside of that, other folks that were alternates for the Seahawks, Boye Mafe. Let's talk about Boye Mafe. This one was interesting to me. This one was interesting to me. So the guys that made it as defensive ends and outside linebackers, I think both of those should count here. Nick Bosa, Rashawn Gary, Micah Parsons, Jonathan Greenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, and Jared Verse. Now, that one's a little bit interesting to me because I look at that and I say, all right, sacks are going to be a primary factor here. Rashawn Gary? Really? Like Rashawn Gary, I'm looking for where he is even on this list. He has 6.5 sacks. Like, I don't get Rashawn Gary making the initial Pro Bowl roster. Let's take a look at pressures. I'll look at edge players and we'll look at pressures. Rashawn Gary, he has 44 pressures. That is the same as Boye Mafe. So I don't get Rashawn Gary really at all. That seems odd to me. Let me just see if I can get NFC. Can I limit it to just NFC? Will that work? NFC. Oh, cool. All right. So Jonathan Greenard makes sense. Led the NFC in pressures, 77. Jared Verse is second in pressures, 75. Nick Bosa, third in pressures, 67. Micah Parsons, fourth in pressures, 66. All four of them made the Pro Bowl. Makes sense. And Micah Parsons did it in 12 games, by the way. From there, the next guy that made the Pro Bowl in the pressures list is number 11, Andrew Van Ginkel with 48. And that's right around where Boye Mafe is with 44. I think it's interesting that he made it. Derek Hall, for what it's worth, has 41 pressures. So even though Derek Hall has a higher sack total, Boye Mafe has 6 sacks. So Rashawn Gary has a half a sack more. Derek Hall has 8 sacks. So it's interesting. Derek Hall has a higher sack number, the kind of glamour stat, but he does have fewer pressures. So I think Boye Mafe has had a more well-rounded season overall. Derek Hall kind of faded a little bit, and I think it sounds like maybe he's been dealing with some injury of some sort, but kind of interesting. Other guys that, you could have made a case for, Dante Fowler for the Washington Commanders had 10.5 sacks. Let's see. I'm looking through the list. Leonard Floyd for the 49ers makes it as an alternate. He had 8.5 sacks. Brian Burns for the Giants had 8 sacks. And maybe Josh Sweat for the Eagles, who had 8 sacks, obviously on a very good defense and in a big market. But it's kind of a down year when it comes to some of the sack totals. So it's interesting there. When I look at other players that might have deserved some consideration, those are like Yaya Diaby for Tampa Bay is someone who probably deserved more of a consideration than he got. Yaya Diaby was 6th in the NFC in pressures. So you could even make some of a case for Chase Young, who was 5th in the NFC in pressures with 62. But I believe this is the first time Boye Mafe has made it as an alternate. And I think that that's good news. I think that he's gaining recognition and appreciation in the NFL. Then Michael Dickson, I'm not going to spend time on punters. Sorry. If you want me to talk about Michael Dickson, I can. I think Michael Dickson had generally a down year by the stats that I think matter most for punters, but he's a well-known name and good for Michael Dickson. Not gonna spend much time there. Now let's talk about some of the players for the Seahawks that did not make it, even as alternates. That's interesting that they did not make it. If I look at the Seahawks, there's a few guys. There's one guy in particular that jumped to mind right away. And really, there's a couple of guys. The first guy that jumps to mind for me is Charles Cross. So Charles Cross not being named as an alternate is interesting to me. If you look at PFF grading, for whatever that's worth, and some people might say it's not worth anything. Fine, but let's just look at PFF grading. Among tackles in the NFL, Charles Cross ranked 9th. And let's just look at NFC players, NFC tackles. Charles Cross came in 7th. And one of the guys that was named as an alternate was Paris Johnson Jr., who was drafted a year after Charles Cross last year, and makes it as an alternate. That one kind of caught my attention. And there's a chart, which I'll show you guys. Let me put it up on the screen for you, that I think is a good way to look at why I think that's not the right outcome. So let me show this to you guys. This is a PFF chart, and I know it's a little bit of an eye chart here, but the way to read this is left to right indicates how much a offensive tackle was left on an island, did not get help to do their job. South to north on this is how much their grade was over the expectation, over the average expected performance when they don't have help. And so obviously, like all charts like this, up and to the right is better. And something that you'll notice is like the Eagles have 2 tackles in the top right, which is really impressive. They're left on islands all the time, and they do amazing when they're doing that. Tristan Wirfs also up there. And as we look at the Pro Bowl roster again, and you look at some of the guys that made the Pro Bowl roster, you'll see that those are guys that made it. Those are guys that made, I'm sorry, I'm searching all over the place for it. Okay, there it is. The tackles that made it, Lane Johnson, Penei Sewell, Tristan Wirfs are the 3 tackles that made it. And Penei Sewell, let's find him in here somewhere. Where's Penei Sewell? Penei Sewell's right here. So Penei Sewell is not left on an island nearly as much, but he does make it. I think there's not much of an argument about it. But interestingly, if you want to find Charles Cross, he's right here. Charles Cross is right here. That's pretty darn good. He's left on an island a lot, and he performs above expectation, a decent amount. Now, where's Paris Johnson? Paris Johnson's right here. So that's a pretty big gap, I think, both in terms of how often he's left on an island, how much he's asked to be asked to do the job by himself, and his performance when he is left on an island. So that is one where, personally, I think there's some question about whether or not they came to the right conclusion about who makes it as an alternate. And yes, I'm well aware of how the voting works and that this is a popularity contest and all that. I'm setting all that aside because basically that's just the way of things. And if you think that Pro Bowls don't matter, talk to agents, talk to players, talk to GMs. It's literally written into contracts. Like, you get more money if you reach the Pro Bowl. And as much as, yes, it's a flawed system, it matters. I happen to believe All-Pro is much more meaningful. It's also a very exclusive club. It's very hard to get in the All-Pro team. That's the best of players at a position across the entire NFL. You think it's hard for Leonard Williams to make it in the Pro Bowl for the NFC? I'm telling you, it's tough sledding getting in there for the entire NFL. So I wouldn't necessarily be holding my breath that there's going to be a lot of better things for the All-Pro. So the other piece, the other person besides, like, Charles Cross for me stood out. The other person, let me look, that kind of got my attention, DK Metcalf. I'm not surprised. I don't think he should have gotten it, but I think it's worth noting, not even an alternate. It's also worth noting, I don't think he should have gotten it, but Kenneth Walker. This matters because I'll talk to you about this in terms of contract implications in a little bit. And then defensively, I think a guy that jumped out to me was Ernest Jones. I think Ernest Jones, he's definitely not going to make it based on his PFF grade, which, by the way, is a 56. But I think Leonard Jones has been one of the best middle linebackers in the NFL, especially since he's been with the Seahawks. And the linebackers that made it, the inside linebackers, were Zach Bond of Philadelphia and Fred Warner. And if you don't know Zach Bond, he's had a hell of a year. So I'm not going to sit here and say, Ernest Jones should have made it over him. And I don't know who the other alternates are. It's, for whatever reason, it's very hard. I think they don't aggregate the folks that are alternates for some odd reason. But if we look defensively let's look at tackles. Let's look at tackles. And I know tackles is a flawed stat, but it matters. And we just look at the NFC. Zach Bond is the second leading player in tackles this year with 151. He also has 3.5 sacks, 11 tackles for loss. The guy deserves to be on there, no question, for a great defense on a good team. From there, Ernest Jones is pretty far down the list. How many tackles does Ernest Jones end up with? He only has 85 tackles this year. He has no sacks, and he only has 1 tackle for loss. I think that's pretty interesting. I felt his impact more than that, but he's pretty far down this list. And so I think it's totally valid that he doesn't make it as an alternate, but it is interesting. Some other names that, deserve attention. Caden Ellis for the Falcons, 141 tackles, 5 sacks, 8 tackles for loss. Also has an interception. Nakobe Dean for the Eagles, 128 tackles, 3 sacks, 9 tackles for loss, also has an interception. Demario Davis is always great for the Saints, 127 tackles, 2 sacks, 1 interception. Bobby Wagner, 124 tackles, 2 sacks, no interceptions. And I thought Bobby was on this, but he's not. Am I misreading this somewhere? I could have sworn I saw that Bobby was on this. Maybe he made it as an alternate. But, Wagner wouldn't surprise me if he still gets all-pro votes. So there's a lot of guys, inside linebackers. I personally really liked Blake Cashman's year for the Vikings. Doesn't have huge doesn't have huge tackle numbers, 104, but does have 4.5 sacks, 8 tackles for loss. I thought he was a very good player for maybe the best defense in the NFL this year. So, yeah, I mean, I think Ernest Jones is a guy that merits some conversation, but I don't think he was robbed of being an alternate. I think it's understandable. I am curious what that's going to do to his contract number. Like, I don't believe, let me double check this. Let's look at Ernest Jones and see if he has made a Pro Bowl previously. Ernest Jones has not made a Pro Bowl previously. And he has had some big years. He, in 2023, 145 tackles, 4.5 sacks, 14 tackles for loss. Still wasn't enough. So when you look at the contract number for inside linebackers, and let me take a look at that right now. You know, you're talking about a lot of guys that are Pro Bowl guys: Roquan Smith, Fred Warner, Tremaine Edmonds, Matt Milano, Patrick Queen, Aziz Al-Shaair, Zaire Franklin. I think you start getting down to like Jordan Brooks, by the way, didn't make the Pro Bowl, didn't make it as an alternate. Just saying. A lot of people wringing their hands about Jordan Brooks. My continued statement about Jordan Brooks was he is not the same level of impact player that you want to make sure no matter what you sign. I'd take Ernest Jones, who's 3 years younger than Jordan Brooks, by the way, at what is probably going to be maybe a cheaper contract. I'm not sure. Like Jordan Brooks got $26 million over 3 years with 8.75 average per year with $17 million guaranteed. It wouldn't surprise me if you're talking about around $8 million a year for Ernest Jones. I don't think that's crazy. That would put him like right around Dre Greenlaw's number and a little bit below Levante David and Demario Davis. I'm not sure he's got the case to be made that he should be paid more than Logan Wilson on the Bengals or Zaire Franklin for the Colts. He is younger. That is his best case to be made. Maybe like he'll try to go for Jeremiah Owusu Koramoah. Sorry. JOK, we'll call him, for the Browns. He's 26. I think he got his deal last year. It is a $37.5 million deal, total value, 12.5 guaranteed, or 12.5 per year average, and 25 million guaranteed. So 12.5 is probably the top end of what Ernest Jones could try to ask for. I think it's going to be closer to like in the 8 million range. So I think that's like I'm telling you, the range for inside linebackers was much lower last year than people expected it to be. It would not surprise me if that's the case again. I don't see him getting more than 9 million per year. I don't see it. Maybe there's a team that would do it, but I know that John Schneider's going to feel like he has to sign him after giving up a 4th round pick to trade for him. And Mike McDonald's like, we're not going through this again next year. Give me my linebacker. So I think he's going to be a Seahawks, but that's kind of where that goes. There are some other implications here. So I wanted to talk about this as well that have literal contractual implications. All right. So Joel Corey, who's a former agent, great guy, had him on the show before. He wrote that a Pro Bowl selection on the original ballot, again, this is not for alternates, original ballot is required for 2nd to 7th round picks to have their fourth-year compensation increased to a second-round restricted free agent tender. This comes under the CBA's proven performance escalator. So being an alternate or replacement player does not qualify you. All right? So why do I bring this up? Well, Riq Woolen made the Pro Bowl as a rookie in 2021. He's already had that escalator. So he's going to have that second round restricted free agent tender for him. This is all coming up for that class because they're entering their final year. But guys that did not meet that, Boye Mafe, Kenneth Walker, Kobe Bryant, and Abe Lucas, all guys that I think the Seahawks are going to want to re-sign, none of them got their RFA tender increased to second round status based off of making the Pro Bowl. So that's, good, bad, whatever. It is what it is. I think the implication there is that their RFA tenders will not increase. And so the question for me is, do those guys automatically become restricted free agents in year 5? Let's check that out. So if we look at who would be a 2020 pick, that'd be like Trey Brown would be a 2020 pick who, if this was an issue, he would be an RFA this year. I don't think that's the case, is it? Let me do one more check on this. These are free agents for the Seahawks. Yeah, he's an unrestricted free agent. So, I don't know. The thing that's a little confusing to me is whether or not, I guess maybe you can tender somebody. I'll have to do some more research on this. Like, I don't expect, will the Seahawks make an RFA tender? If anyone knows the answer to this, let me know. But RFA tender rules. All right, let me see if I can pull this up for us while we're doing this here, because I think it's relevant. Okay, like a franchise tag, a restricted tender protects the team from losing internal talent. Teams can place first round, second round, and right of first refusal tenders on players. Each tender is a 1-year contract with a value based on the level of the tender. For example, a first round tender would yield a first round pick from another team if an offer sheet wasn't matched. A second round pick would go to a departing team if a restricted free agent didn't have an offer sheet that matched on a second round tender. Got it. All that makes sense. If a player is tendered at the original round, right of first refusal level, so for Trey Brown, that would be, I think he was a 4th round pick. The club is entitled to a draft choice equal to the round in which the player was selected. The team wouldn't receive compensation if the player wasn't drafted or was tendered at the lowest of the 4 levels. Restricted free agents are typically players who've been cut or injured during their rookie deals or former undrafted free agents. When the deal runs out, the player is technically a free agent, hasn't accrued enough time to be an unrestricted free agent. So I believe this only applies okay. I believe this only applies if you haven't been in the NFL for a certain number of years. So I don't think, for example, that these RFA tender things are going to really matter probably for the Seahawks in this case. I'll double check that, but that's my initial read on initial research. The other piece that's relevant here is Charles Cross. Charles Cross, so this is another bit from Joel Corey. To qualify for a fifth-year option that's equal to or to either the franchise or the transition tag at a player's position, the player must be selected to the Pro Bowl on the original ballot. Being an alternate or replacement player doesn't qualify. Why does that matter? Well, because this is the last time Charles Cross could have accomplished that, then what it means is that his fifth-year option stays, I think, at around 18 million instead of going up to what would have been 22 million, I believe. So I'm double checking that I've got the right number there. Yeah, so his fifth-year option for Charles Cross would be 18.4 million. If he had gotten a Pro Bowl, initial roster, not as an alternate, that would have bumped up to 22.7 million. So the fact that he's got a fifth-year option at 18 million, I think the Seahawks pick up that fifth-year option. I think they might choose to just sign him to an extension, but they won't hesitate to have him. 18 million a year for him at left tackle is a no-brainer. So that's 4 million in cap space difference. I think that has some relevance, but again, that's a 2026 decision or 2026 implication to cap space, not really a 2025. So that's kind of like the whole deal there on the Pro Bowl stuff. I think it's great that Devon Witherspoon made it. I think it's fitting that he is the first person to make it the first 2 years of his career as a Seahawk since Russell Wilson. And we'll kind of see. We'll see what happens with the alternates. I expect Leonard Williams to get in. We'll see what happens with All Pro. But I think the other pieces that I would bring up that I wanted to spend at least a minute on is what's going on in the rest of the NFC West. So the Cardinals, let me double check. They get Trey McBride and they get Trey McBride and Budda Baker are their starters. Their alternates are DJ Dallas, Paris Johnson, and kicker Chad Ryland. I'm not going to talk about kickers, whatever, or kick returners, by the way. I don't care about that. Paris Johnson Jr., we already talked about. I think that's the wrong one. I think Charles Cross had a better season. They're pretty close. It's not like egregious, but I think Charles Cross deserved it more than Paris Johnson. But interesting, 2 Pro Bowlers and then 3 alternates. The Seahawks, 1 Pro Bowler, 5 alternates. Depending on how you see it, like obviously Pro Bowl starters is a better implication of quality than alternate, generally speaking, but not necessarily. And then if we look at the 49ers got George Kittle. They got Kyle Juszczyk at fullback. I mean, the guy was awful this year. And the fact that fullback is still a position that gets its own is just a joke. It's just not even, most teams don't have one. It's just a joke. So whatever. They got him. They interestingly got no offensive lineman, which I think is right. They got Fred Warner and they got Nick Bosa. I think Fred Warner started the year as like a defensive player of the year level player. Once he got hurt, he was not that good for most of the season. I don't have a huge issue with him making it. He's great. George Kittle certainly deserved it. Nick Bosa, don't like the guy, but hard to make the case against him. So that makes some sense. As far as alternates for the 49ers, Leonard Floyd, who I already mentioned, Diamador Lenore, their cornerback. I think a lot of 49ers fans expected him to make it to the Pro Bowl, not as an alternate. Brock Purdy was an alternate. Interesting. And then Trent Williams was an alternate. I think that guy's done. And if you look at that list, Diamador Lenore and Brock Purdy, they're going to be around for a little while. But George Kittle, I don't know how many more years he's going to be around. Fred Warner should be around. He's young enough, but definitely had an injury. Nick Bosa should be around. So like they got a couple of guys that will be around. Still, you'd probably argue the most talented crew of like their best players in the NFC West. For the Rams, they got one player who was Jared Verse. Man, my draft crush, one of my draft crushes, Jared Verse, and he deserves it. As far as I can tell, they got no alternates. I looked around. If somebody has different information, let me know. But I see some people asking questions. I'll say this again. Pro Bowl is decided by 3 discrete mechanisms. A third of it is fan voting, a third of it is player voting, and a third of it is coaches voting. So it's not all fan votes anymore. That used to be the case. But the point that I'm kind of trying to make here is the 2 teams that really were fighting for the division this year had the least amount of Pro Bowlers. It was interesting. Rams have 1. Seahawks have 1. They're both young defensive players. The 49ers still have a fair share, but their number was cut in half year over year. And I think there's a real case to be made. It will continue to decline. A lot of the players that are on there, I think, are still like declining players. And the Cardinals have a couple of guys on there, and then they have their alternates. So what am I saying overall? I'm just saying from a overall talent evaluation perspective, it's gotten a lot tighter in this division. And I believe that the Seahawks are still in a decent spot to end up being the team with the majority, the most Pro Bowlers and most blue chips over the next 3 years. I think there's a decent chance of that. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I fall looking at this overall list. There's some other takeaways here. I mean, you look at the offensive line. We'll kind of talk about that at some point, but the guards that made it, Landon Dickerson for the Eagles, Tyler Smith for the Cowboys, Chris Lindstrom for the Falcons, the center, Cam Jurgens for Philadelphia, Frank Ragnow for Detroit. So the Eagles have a Pro Bowl tackle, a Pro Bowl guard, and a Pro Bowl center, and you could pretty easily argue they should have 2 Pro Bowl tackles. So yeah, it helps. It helps. I think the offensive line for them has been a massive part of why they are who they are. And then Detroit, similarly, Pro Bowl tackle in Penei Sewell, Pro Bowl center in Frank Ragnow. Also a pretty healthy representation there. Also interesting, Jaden Daniels makes the Pro Bowl as a rookie. I think well earned. Sam Darnold, Jared Goff. Interesting names to be your Pro Bowl players at quarterback. I don't think that anybody would have guessed those would be the 3 names as your Pro Bowl representatives for the NFC this year. I also believe, if I'm remembering right, yes, Patrick Mahomes doesn't make the Pro Bowl. That's pretty crazy. And I think it's probably right from an overall performance perspective, although you could pretty much say the reason that the Chiefs have the record they have is because of Patrick Mahomes. So, I think the defense is outstanding. So that too. So yeah, I think that's kind of where things stand with the Pro Bowl for the Seahawks and where things listed. I know a lot of people get way more worked up about this than I do. I know how good Leonard Williams was this year. I don't need someone to tell me that. He's certainly blue chip level player this year. I know Charles Cross made big strides this year. I don't need somebody to tell me that. I am interested to just kind of see how this progresses over the next couple of years. And if the Seahawks want to get more representation here, easiest way to do it is be a good team. Like, you do that and a lot of things start to come into place. All right, everybody. If you haven't already given the show a like and click subscribe, I would ask you to please do that. Appreciate you taking the time to do that. Give us a follow over there on TikTok. And then it is not too late. We still have one more game to play. If you have not used code HawkBlogger to get 10% off JK Boots at jkboots.com, you will want to do this. These are the best boots you'll ever own. It is a family-owned, Washington-operated, Spokane-based company. People just tune into their YouTube channel to watch how they work leather. That's 300,000 people subscribe to just watch what they do with leather. That's how good these guys are at what they do. They're great people too. I've gotten to know them. And not only do you get 10% off, but as I reach down to grab them, you get a chance to win these Seahawks themed pair of boots. You get gray bison leather, green, and the blue tongue. Really cool. You'll be the only person on the planet that gets them. It'll take like 6 to 8 weeks for them to make it just for your feet or for someone that you love and you want to give them to. And we've already given away 3 pairs of boots to the Wildland Firefighters Foundation so that our Northwest firefighters are protected in their firefighting boots. So absolutely great promotion. Make sure you use code HawkBlogger. A lot of folks over the last few days have been taking advantage. They all have the same chance to potentially get those Seahawks themed boots, and you're all helping to keep our Northwest forests beautiful. So appreciate everybody. We will talk more tomorrow when Mike Sando will join the show. Also, talk more tonight on Real Hawk Talk at 6 o'clock. So I will see you then. Until then, have a great rest of your Thursday.